time then to put your questions to our expert panel. Laura Suter is Head of Personal Finance at AJ Bell, the investment platform, and Nina Skero, Chief Executive at the Centre for Economics and Business Research. Good to see you both. We're also joined tonight by Sumi Rabindrakumar, Head of Policy and Research at the Trussell Trust, which runs, of course, a network of food banks across the country. Ladies, very good to see you tonight. Thank you for your time today. I suppose we start with the questions, and that's what we're here for, isn't it? First question comes from Twitter. The Prime Minister says that jobs are the answer to the cost of living crisis. What about those in low-paid, insecure jobs? I suppose a question for you, perhaps, Laura, to start things off.
Yeah, so part of the logic behind that is that we have very low unemployment at the moment, and so that means that there's a bit of a war for talent out there, and so wages should rise accordingly. But as this person points out, that's not very good for people that are on lower paid jobs or just don't have the ability to move jobs. I think the government's other solution is people upskilling, but clearly that takes time. It takes time for people to learn a new industry or a new job, so that's not an overnight solution for people struggling with their energy bills now.
And Nina, maybe I can just ask you that this really has come out of nowhere and people do seem to need help now, not any later, don't they?
They absolutely do, and especially keeping in mind that for some households, they already had a couple of challenging years with COVID, and now they're entering this new cost of living crisis right on the back of that. And in fact, I wouldn't be surprised, despite the current rhetoric from the government, if we did see some targeted support in not too long, because I think we're going to get to a point where the government really doesn't have a choice but to recognize that more assistance is needed urgently.
Well, we'll come to perhaps what some of those solutions might be. At a tail end of this question, most people using food banks already have jobs. A point for you there, Sumi.
Yeah, certainly in the UK, food bank need is a really stark reflection that for many, work alone isn't going to be the solution. We see some people in work. We also see quite a few people, so up to about a third, who've had difficult work experiences and are now between jobs because of the insecurity in the labour market. And then finally, just to point out that actually the really overrepresented groups who come to food banks in our network are people who can't work or face barriers to work. So that's, for example, disabled people. 62% of people referred are disabled. That's 3 times the rate in the general population. So, you know, we need to face the reality that jobs are not going to be the solution for everyone, particularly if you're talking about tackling food bank need. And we shouldn't be cutting whole groups of people adrift by ignoring that fact.
All right, let's hear from Jim. My one job isn't enough, Jim says, with the cost of living crisis. Do I get a second job? It's a fair question, isn't it, Laura? Should he?
Yeah, I think a lot of people will be facing this. I think if your income isn't enough to meet the rising cost of living and the bills that you've got going out, you have 2 options. You either need to increase your income or you need to reduce the cost of your bills, and you can do a bit of both. But if taking on a second job is an option and it's something that you have available to you, then that can be one way of balancing the books. Obviously, for lots of people, it may not be possible to take on those additional hours or to take on a whole extra job.
Yes, Nina, for some might be an answer to some, but it's perhaps more difficult in practice for many.
Yes, I do imagine that some are already working full hours at a job that, despite working full hours, isn't paying them enough to face the very stark and, you know, very rapidly arriving costs of living rises. And what I think is a particular worry is that, given what we're hearing now, I fear that things will get worse before they get better in terms of the energy prices, which also trickle down onto prices of other services and goods. I think things are going to get significantly worse in the coming months. So people that are already facing problems are probably in for quite a difficult period.
And Sumi, what are people telling you when they come to food banks? Are they feeling they have to get additional employment if they can? Perhaps most very difficult for a lot of people, though.
Of course, as we were just saying, there are lots of groups of people who come to food banks. People who are most at risk are people who can't take on those additional hours, often because they're doing unpaid work like caring for family members, or because they have a disability or mental health problems. So that option is really restricted for quite a few people. And that's why we see people coming to food banks, because they don't have those other options available to them. And they also don't have the security of a sort of adequate lifeline from the benefit system.
OK, let's move on. Rowley says it's clear to see that many households are facing significant cost of living crises, and this is going to result in people losing their houses and jobs. Why can't the government see this and act now? Perhaps you can address this for us, Nina.
Yes, I would say, as I was saying a moment ago, I actually would expect the government to come out with some targeted reliefs in not too long. We were expecting, if we think back to the spring statement, we were actually expecting some more targeted relief to already be announced at that point, and that was certainly before the situation got as bad as it is now. I wouldn't be surprised at all if in the coming weeks we saw some sort of additional one-off assistance offered to people, perhaps receiving universal credit, or some sort of an assistance to people who normally receive the warm homes discount. So I think some sort of targeted assistance rather than something very broad brush like VAT cut would be most appropriate at this point.
And Laura, is that the way forward? Something targeted? We know we had the Queen's speech just the other day. Much was made that hardly anything was announced then to tackle the cost of living crisis. Much debate in the Commons afterwards that something did need to be done. And it does seem the government is moving in that direction to do something. But is that the correct course of action? And will it help now, which is what people are really asking?
Yeah, so I think the government has announced some targeted support, specifically at energy bills. We've had the kind of energy loan scheme that will kick in later this year, and council tax rebate of £150 for a lot of households. And I think it's that kind of support that we're probably going to see more of. I think later in the year we have the autumn statement, which is another kind of mini budget. But also in October we have the next energy price cap change. And that's when we're all going to see our energy bills go up by even more. And I think at that point, that might be when the government is waiting to make more announcements about targeted support, particularly for energy bills. But like you alluded to there, for lots of families, by that point, they're already going to have had to have taken on debt to pay their bills, and they're already going to have faced a lot of financial hardship if we don't get any help before then.
Well, stay with us, because that leads us to our next question. Keith says, I'm a pensioner and I cannot claim pension credit. I already shop for all the bargain buys and I know how to cook, but still I cannot afford my electricity. What am I supposed to do? Many people will indeed be asking that tonight.
I think so, and I think Keith sums up one of the big issues that we've seen so far, which is that pensioners have been left out in the cold a bit. So what we saw is the amount that the state pension increased by was changed this year, and so it didn't rise by as much as it could have done. And the increase that it's seen now looks tiny in comparison to the inflation rates that we're seeing at the moment. And no specific support has been targeted at pensioners, and particularly those that live just on the state pension. So I think lots of pensioners are feeling like they would have expected more support in the spring statement that we talked about earlier, and we might see more of that help. One thing that I would say is that if people are really struggling, there's lots of help out there that people might not necessarily know that they're eligible for. So the government has filtered down some funding to local councils that people can go and apply for. So this is kind of help that you need to apply for rather than an automatic rebate like we saw with the council tax. Or it's worth going to an organisation like Citizens Advice, where they'll be able to look at your income, your outgoings, and see if there's any additional benefits or support that you might be eligible to, because so many benefits out there are underclaimed and people could be getting more money.
And Nina, let me put this to you, linked to pensions. Peter asks, what about people living on a state pension? £350 doesn't even touch the size. I presume that's for two people. Tax cuts don't help us, and the extra council fund cannot help with income. And it has to be said, of course, that people are getting a council tax rebate. Well, not everybody, but many households. But to fund the electricity, the hikes in energy prices, this is a loan and it does have to be paid back.
Yes, or at least that is what is structured at the moment. Again, if the situation continues to worsen, it's not, I know it hasn't been announced yet, but I wouldn't be entirely shocked if what is now being sort of discussed as a loan ends up being converted to a grant down the line. We've seen similar changes in the past. Perhaps, for example, for some of the COVID relief, so we've seen that the sort of assistance offered can be quite fluid.
OK, well, do stay with us. Thank you for all your comments and thoughts for now. You are watching, to remind you, a special question and answer programme on the cost of living crisis here on Sky News. And next we'll be asking, why are people on disability benefits being ignored? See you in a couple of minutes. Hello, you're welcome back to Sky News Tonight. This is a special question and answer programme on the cost of living crisis. Joining us, our guest, Laura Suter, Head of Personal Finance at the investment platform AJ Bell, Nina Skero, Chief Executive at the Centre for Economics and Business Research, and Sumi Rabindrakumar, Head of Policy and Research at the Trussell Trust, which runs food banks. Thanks for staying with us. Let us move on with these questions. Anil asks a question: why are prices increasing at higher rates than inflation? This is going to make inflation worse. Rising interest rates will mean people will have even less money to buy essentials, and that will cause the cost of living crisis to get worse. Nina, let me put that to you. No end in sight to any of this, it seems.
Right. I think there are two quite distinct parts to that question. So first, one on why are prices rising higher than the rate of inflation. So the way the rate of inflation is calculated is based on a survey where people say how much of their overall expenditure they spend on particular goods and services. And then based on those answers, you weigh up how much of significance, how much of a weight to give to each product and service. You put in what is called the consumer basket of goods.
Put it in this basket.
So it's really,
changes, it?
So it's really a weighted average. So there are questions of, is what we're putting in that, metaphorical basket correct? Are things weighted correctly? So it's very much a weighted average. So it's entirely possible that depending on your own consumption patterns, you could be facing price increases faster than what the typical consumer is facing. And I often feel this way myself. I've been saying for a while, I feel like my own inflation rate is probably close at 25%, well, twice over. The other part of the question was relating to interest rates. And it's entirely correct to point out that it's quite unusual to have a situation where the economy is slowing sharply, yet interest rates are rising. And it's a very unusual and an unenviable situation for the Bank of England to be in. It's partially because they're trying to control inflationary pressures, some of which are still lingering from sort of demand-driven inflation earlier in 2021 and is now being compounded by the Russia-Ukraine situation and supply chain issues. I do see the need to raise interest rates to help on the inflationary side. And the way that helps is by higher interest rates, mean that there is less money available, which controls the amount of demand that there is and controls price levels. But it's entirely correct to point out that it's quite counterintuitive to doing that when the economy is already slowing.
Yeah, we see the interest rates are going up. Let me put that to Sumi, the fact inflation, people facing rising costs, that's something that people must be telling you as they come to food banks. It seems everything, the cost of everything to many is going up.
Absolutely. We've done polling and that shows that people are really struggling with just the bare essentials, like clothing, toiletries, food, right across the board. And actually it's a combination of those things. So it's not just struggling with one bill, it's the fact that it's multiple bills that are piling up and people are having to choose which essentials they go without, or sort of how much debt they're pulled into because they can't afford these spiralling costs. And it's really reflected in the level of need that we're seeing in our network of food banks at the moment, which has been accelerating exactly since this cost of living crisis first emerged in the autumn. And we think that it's set to get worse given the direction of travel of inflation rates.
I'll come back to you in a moment, ask about cookery lessons. For now, though, Ian says, my power is supplied by a nuclear power station, a solar farm, and one of the biggest offshore wind farms in Europe. Why has the price of my electricity gone up? Perhaps one for you, Nina? How can you answer that?
Well, based on the energy strategy we've heard about recently from the government, it seems like their thinking is similar to Ian's, in the sense that they're thinking if we can reduce our foreign energy dependence and boost the sources of energy that Ian has listed there, solar, wind, nuclear, the country won't be as susceptible to future shocks. But as we've heard from the strategy, that is really not going to do anything with this crisis. You know, their time frame is sort of 2030 and beyond. And the reality is, at the moment, the UK, like much of Europe, is still dependent on energy imports. And even if we are getting less of our energy than some European countries directly from Russia, it doesn't mean it's isolated from these global shocks, because the markets that the UK does source its imports from are raising their prices in recognition of the lowered overall available supply because of the Russia-Ukraine situation.
All right, we'll come back to that in a moment, and calls for a windfall tax. I know that's something we need to discuss. A question for Sumi. This from Margot. I had cookery lessons at school. Now children don't. Simple recipe leaflets would help. Do food banks offer fresh food? That question, of course, in relation to the Conservative MP Lee Anderson. Didn't he claim that people who use food banks don't know how to cook or manage their finances properly, can't cook, can't budget effectively, what he had to say?
In answer to sort of the question here around sort of fresh food, certainly some food banks do offer fresh food if they can, and they have local partnerships that allow them to do that. But really, the point here is, you know, that reflects the fact that food banks will always do whatever they can to step up and help their community as much as they can. But really, it shouldn't be left to frontline organisations like food banks to ensure that people can put food on the table. And the stark reality is that people simply don't have enough income to be able to put food on the table and afford the essentials. Our research shows that the average income of someone referred to a food bank in our network was about £57 a week. That's simply not enough to stretch across all the essential bills that we all need to pay, you know, keep a roof over our heads, food on the table, and so on. So what this comes down to is food bank need is really about lack of income. It's not about food, it's not about cooking. And that's the stark reality that people are facing. And that's exactly why, harking back to your question about sort of inflation rates, why we are focusing so much on the fact that urgent action needs to be taken to strengthen our social security system so people have that lifeline to be able to afford those essentials. And in particular, at the moment, bring benefit rates in line with the inflation that we're seeing at the moment. Because otherwise people are left without options, and really what they're telling us is there are no more cutbacks to make.
Let's talk about benefits. A question from Pamela. Why are people on disability benefits specifically being ignored? No uplift, Pamela says, during the pandemic. The warm home payment is about to be reduced by 300,000 people. Question for Laura. Is that correct, what Pamela said there?
So it is and it isn't. So the warm home discount scheme is being restructured by the government, and it's been targeted at people on means-tested benefits. It means that an extra 750,000 people will be eligible for it, and actually the amount is increasing. So previously it was £140 towards your energy bills, now it's £150. However, part of that change means that lots of people on disability benefits are no longer going to be eligible for it. So that's where that 300,000 figure comes from. And so it means that lots of those people are going to be left without that money and still paying high energy costs. And it's worth pointing out as well that disabled people generally face higher energy costs, either through being in the home more or having specialist medical equipment that they need that needs power, or, for instance, needing to wash their clothes more. There are lots of reasons why they would have higher energy needs, but also benefits haven't increased by the rate of inflation, and so their income isn't rising to match that.
Very interesting. All right, thank you again for now. Do stay with us. You're watching a special question and answer programme on cost of living crisis. Next, we'll be asking, if fuel companies are making record profits, why are we still paying such high fuel costs? Back after the break. So then let's answer some more of your questions with our expert panel. Joining us tonight, Laura Suter, Head of Personal Finance at AJ Bell, the investment platform. Nina Skero is Chief Executive at the Centre for Economics and Business Research. Good to see you. And Sumi Rabindrakumar, Head of Policy and Research at the Trussell Trust, which of course runs a network of food banks across the country. Great to see you all. Right, let's crack on with our questions then. Raj asks, with the rising cost of living and economy shrinking, is it time for the Chancellor to take a radical step before the UK ends up in recession? Nina, one for you. Much speculation that we are going to enter a recession sometime this year. The Chancellor says he's looking at various measures in what we just saw there. But he really does need to take some concrete action, doesn't he?
The Chancellor is in a rather unenviable position because he is actually in a place of, coming off of a couple of years of quite loose fiscal policy. So basically being very generous with public spending in light of the COVID pandemic. So just as the time has come for him to basically raise government's revenues via taxes and to consider where he can cut government spending, he's now being called upon to actually help bolster the economy. In terms of what we're expecting to see from the Chancellor, again, I would expect to see some targeted support for the poorest households. I certainly wouldn't hold my breath for an expansive package of government fiscal support, again, because of where their thinking is in terms of just having had 2 years of quite a lot of spending and the feeling that that needs to come under control.
Laura, he put this furlough scheme in place. Some would see this as fairly rapid, but here we are with a cost of living crisis that's only going to get worse in the next few months. People will ask, why can't he do anything right now?
Yeah, and I think people have, maybe because of the pandemic, they've got used to the government acting relatively quickly. And that was, the phrase unprecedented time has been used a lot, but that was an unprecedented time. And as Nina pointed to, we've now rolled into another slightly unprecedented time. I think that the government is trying to have a balancing act between not spending too much government money at a time when it's already racked up a lot of debt through the pandemic, but also trying to help people out where it can. And so I agree that I think we'll see more specific help for things like energy bills or more council tax rebates, kind of expansions of those schemes that we've already seen, rather than any radical, massive announcement of government spending at this point.
And Sumi, just briefly, tell me 2 key things that you would like the Chancellor to do now to help the cost of living crisis.
Well, we know that people can't afford to wait much longer. They're already facing these impossible decisions around, their living standards. And what we really want to see is that targeted support for people on the very lowest incomes who actually, to date, in terms of the support packages that have been announced in response to the crisis, have really been piecemeal. They haven't been targeted on people on the lowest incomes. They don't reach people quickly enough and they don't go far enough. And we have a system that is specifically designed for circumstances like this that targets support quickly and efficiently to those who need it most, and that's the social security system. So what we want to see is investment in that system, particularly as an urgent step, bringing payments in line with the inflation that we're seeing at the moment. It's quite interesting that both the Chancellor and the Prime Minister has talked about the steps that they took during the pandemic as examples of their compassion and their speedy response. And yet the glaring gap in the current cost of living crisis support that has been announced so far is precisely that investment in social security that we saw during the pandemic, like the uplift, £20 uplift a week to universal credit. That is missing and that needs to be rectified.
All right, let's crack on. The Chancellor, Mike, asks, took 5p off fuel tax, but how does that help people who can't afford a car? In fact, as transport costs go up, we have to pay more to use public transport, therefore making us worse off. Would it not have been better to cut VAT so everyone gained, not just the better off? Perhaps I can put that to you, Laura.
Yeah, I mean, I entirely agree. I think that the 5p cut to the fuel duty, for one, didn't go anywhere near counteracting the price increases that we'd already seen, but also you've got to be at a certain wealth level to be able to afford a car. And lots of people, as Mike was saying, can't afford a car, and so they're using public transport, and we've seen massive increases in train fares, for example. So I think what people would rather see, rather than perhaps some headline-grabbing news around fuel getting cheaper, is actually much more targeted support at low-income families who are really struggling at the moment, who couldn't even think about buying a car and putting petrol in it because that would be so far beyond their budget at the moment.
All right, Andy says successive governments have kicked the can of long-term, secure, affordable power supply down the road for decades. Why doesn't the government consider nationalising all utility companies, electricity, gas and water? Is that something you might be able to comment on, Nina?
Well, we have seen other European countries considering options such as nationalization of utility providers. It hasn't been with much seriousness discussed recently in the UK. We certainly didn't get any indication of that happening from the government's energy strategy that was discussed recently. I would say that even though the sort of green agenda and energy security has been talked about for a long time, I do think the next few years are going to see more of a serious focus on the topic, partially because of the Russia-Ukraine situation, because no matter what happens with the war from here on out, even if the war ended tomorrow, nobody is going to want to be dependent on Russian exports for many decades ahead. So I think despite the economic downturn, there is going to be continued pressure for the government and private companies to continue investing in domestic energy supplies. So I would expect to see more of that in terms of where the government is thinking the solution lies.
All right, John says, can you please address why the record profits for fuel companies like BP are not being filtered back to the people? If these companies are making record profits, why we're still paying such high fuel costs, Laura?
Yeah, so I think the difficulty here is the government doesn't want to commit to what would be called a windfall tax. Previous governments have done it, and this would be a one-off tax that's focused on energy companies and those particular profits that they're making at the moment. Clearly, the
tide is shifting, though, on that, isn't it? Even with the Chancellor now saying he's looking at a pragmatic approach, potentially.
Yeah, it does seem like the weight of public opinion is shifting. I think it's a tricky one. I think there are winners and losers in it, and it's a fairly blunt tool, to be honest, in applying this kind of one-off tax. What we've also got to bear in mind is lots of pension funds own those companies and benefit from the dividends they pay out, and those pensions are held by all of us. And so any money that's taken off those companies and paid in tax is less money they can pay out to investors, which also impacts individuals in terms of their pension fund. So it's a tricky balancing act, but yeah, there is a lot of weight opinion pushing the government towards it.
Oh, we'll see what happens on the windfall tax. Thank you for now. You're watching a special question and answer programme on Sky News tonight on the cost of living crisis. Next, we will ask what happened to the job retention incentives for small businesses during the pandemic. After the break. Hello, welcome back to Sky News Tonight. You're watching a special question and answer programme on the cost of living crisis. Families and businesses are straining under a weight of global price increases, largely caused by demand outstripping supply post-pandemic. And in recent months, the effects, of course, of the war in Ukraine. Well, Sky's Ivor Bennett has been examining how global forces may be eroding living standards right here in the UK.
The UK economy is flatlining. This chart shows GDP going back 15 years, and you can see we fall off the COVID cliff and then rapidly climb back up. But the last 2 months show zero growth in February and a contraction last month of 0.1%. Now, the UK is not alone. It's mid-table in the G7 of major economies, measured by real GDP that's adjusted for inflation. And you can see we're growing slower than the likes of the US, Canada and France, but faster than Germany, Japan and Italy. But here's the problem. Inflation has soared in the last year, reaching 7% in March, and it's forecast by the Bank of England to exceed 10% by the end of the year. The main reason is the energy crisis. Soaring gas and oil prices have already increased domestic bills by more than 50% and pushed up costs across the entire economy. And consumer confidence is fragile. We're no longer hiding from COVID, but spending is falling as fuel and food bills eat up a larger proportion of our budgets. And then there's the war in Ukraine. Russia's invasion is not fully reflected in these figures, but it will increase pressure on the energy market and hit grain and cooking oil supplies around the world. As a result, come the autumn, household energy bills may have increased by more than £1,000 in a year, increasing pressure on the government to act. Tax cuts are being considered. A 1% cut to income tax would cost £5 billion and be worth £175 to every taxpayer. But cutting income tax helps the better off most and would come just months after national insurance was increased to fund the NHS. Increasing benefit payments would target the most in need. They have gone up 3.1%, raising that to 8% in line with the expected inflation, would cost £9 billion for a year, but it would go straight into the pockets of those struggling the most. Whatever he does, the Chancellor says he's considering a windfall tax on oil and gas company profits to pay for it. First proposed by Labour, they say it would raise £2 billion, but that only saves £60 on every bill. Any help will be welcome, of course, but it will come at a cost to the public finances. The worst of COVID may be behind us, but the cost of living squeeze has only just begun.
Ivor Bennett there. Well, let's answer some more of your questions with our expert panel in the studio tonight. Laura Suter, Head of Personal Finance at the investment platform AJ Bell. Also, Nina Skero, Chief Executive at the Centre for Economics and Business Research. And Sumi Rabindrakumar, Head of Policy and Research at the Trussell Trust, which runs a network of food banks across the country. Thank you for bearing with us. Let's move on with our questions in the last segment of our programme tonight. A question through Instagram. Does the government have a long-term plan rather than just short-term solutions? Laura, we know this crisis is going to go on for some time, so one would think the government would have to look to the long term here.
You would hope so, but at the moment it feels like they are announcing and releasing policy slightly more off the hoof and reacting to the current crisis. So when we saw energy bills rise in April, ahead of that, we saw an announcement specifically about energy bills. We saw changes to the national insurance increase that still brought the increase in, but adjusted it and made the system very complicated to understand, but made it cheaper for some people. I think at the moment what we're struggling to see is that coherent long-term policy of this is the support the government will provide over the next year. And instead, it feels like they're reacting more to the current crisis on their plate and how to deal with that.
Nina, is it a fact that the government may be waiting till later in the year to see really how bad the situation gets before deciding on any long-term action?
That is possible, but the risk is that if they wait too long, the situation will get even worse than it would have gotten if they act sooner. So I think there is already enough evidence to suggest and to show just how many households are struggling. The economists are unanimous in saying that inflation will stay elevated for longer. You have also economic forecasters, including the Bank of England, expecting a recession. So I think there is already sufficient evidence to suggest that it's time to act now rather than put people through further hardship before something is done.
All right, talking of hardship, Darren says, I have a choice, council tax or electricity and gas and food. It's not hard to choose the winner. Sumi, people are across the board having to make choices, aren't they?
That's right. And I think really what this example shows from Darren is that there's no longer really choices anymore. These are just impossible decisions about which essentials they can cover. It's not about having a buffer where you can start tightening your purse strings and decide what to, where to prioritise your finances. What people are telling us when they come to food banks is that there aren't any further cutbacks to make. They're sort of out of options. And also food bank managers are telling us that they also feel that they're out of options too, that people are doing all they can. They're trying to ensure that they're claiming everything that they're eligible for, they're budgeting, they're prioritising, that they're on their household spending, but there's nothing really left to do to manage the cost of living crisis at the moment. And actually, we have seen that in our network for a number of years now for some people. But what's really concerning is that this is obviously accelerating and gathering speed, and we know that things are set to get worse, as has been said, this autumn. And so really now's the time for the government to step in and show that they recognise the sort of emergency that's really unfolding now for many people in our communities.
All right, we'll come back to you very shortly. Adam says on the 5th of November 2020, the government cancelled the job retention bonus, a £1,000 incentive to employers to retain staff, and continued topping up their furlough. What happened to the retention incentive that failed to materialise? The many thousands of pounds employers are owed have a massively detrimental effect on businesses. Is there any intention, Adam asks, to repay the debts? Nina, let's put that one to you.
I certainly don't think there is any intention of bringing that back, and I think the Chancellor has been quite definitive in the way he's talked about that, the justification being that was cancelled because the furlough scheme was extended. Now, it's certainly valid to ask questions about is it reasonable, is it fair to make an announcement, have businesses make business decisions on the back of that announcement, and then basically say that things have changed and that assistance won't be forthcoming. I would say, in aggregate, that the furlough scheme in the UK was very generous and lasted for quite a long time. So hopefully most businesses would have benefited, that needed it that time, would have benefited from the ability to keep staff on furlough for longer and were able to get some form of assistance, if not that specific £1,000 per employee coming back from furlough.
OK, a final question. We are a couple, this is through Twitter, earning a total of £35,000 annually after tax. We are bringing up 3 children, spending on basics and still saving some for holidays. Why can't other people start acting wisely? A quick one for you, Laura. That's pretty unfair to many people, many might suggest.
Yes, I think so. I think, but it probably echoes the views of some people out there who think, well, I'm doing fine. Prices have gone up a little bit, but I can still afford it. Everyone else should just budget. And I think it just depends massively on your circumstances, how you came into this cost of living crisis, whether the pandemic impacted your finances dramatically or not. And so I think while that person's doing very well, other people are really struggling, and it's not just a case of cutting back on Netflix or shopping at a cheaper shop.
And final word to you, Sumi, in a quick sentence. When you hear that, why can't other people start acting wisely? What do you think?
I think for some people, they are fortunate enough to have a buffer to choose, to change their spending decisions. For people on the very lowest incomes, people that need to use food banks, they don't have that option. They don't have the luxury of that option. And that's why we need government action to ensure that people are protected from the very worst of the crisis that's unfolding at the moment.
All right, Sumi Rabindrakumar, Nina Skero and Laura Suter, thank you very much indeed for joining us on our special Q&A programme.